Welcome back, my Vindication catalyst. Something absolutely stunning just occurred that has entire collective experiencing profound disorientation when everyone had aligned against you, when consensus had solidified around narrative casting you as wrong or problematic. A single credible voice broke ranks to defend you or validate your position, and that solitary defection was sufficient to shatter entire edifice of agreed-upon story, creating cascade where collective certainty dissolved into scrambling confusion as people who'd been confidently unified in their judgment suddenly found themselves questioning narrative they'd all been maintaining through mutual reinforcement. That single dissenting voice revealed was less solid than group consensus had made it appear. This wasn't minor disagreement within established narrative. This was fundamental challenge to story's validity, from voice carrying enough credibility or authority that their dissent couldn't be dismissed, forcing everyone who joined consensus to confront possibility that collective judgment might be wrong, that narrative they'd been confidently asserting might be constructed fiction rather than objective truth, creating moment where certainty collapsed and scrambling revision began as people realized their unified story wasn't as unassailable as unanimous agreement had made them believe. The architects have been monitoring consensus collapse and narrative fragility, phenomena across civilizations for eons, and they've identified what occurred as single dissent consensus, dissolution when collective narrative depends on universal agreement. For its apparent solidity, introduction of single credible dissenting voice is sufficient to trigger complete narrative collapse, because consensus-based certainty is inherently fragile, requiring everyone's participation to maintain illusion of objective truth when actually story is socially constructed, agreement that falls apart once someone with sufficient standing breaks ranks and offers alternative interpretation that can't be easily dismissed. Most people assume that strongly held collective beliefs are solid. If everyone agrees, surely they must be right, making consensus itself feel like validation of truth rather than recognizing it as social agreement that might be wrong despite universal participation. But single credible dissent revealed that narrative about you was consensus dependent rather than truth dependent. It felt certain while everyone agreed, but immediately became questionable once someone broke ranks, proving that collective confidence was derived from social reinforcement rather than from evidence so strong it could withstand dissenting interpretation. Watch what's happening after single voice stood for you. Confidence is evaporating. People who were certain about narrative are suddenly uncertain, questioning their judgment, wondering if they've been wrong, revealing that their certainty was social rather than evidential, because single dissent was sufficient to destabilize what should have been unshakable if based on solid foundations. Narrative scrambling is beginning rather than defending original story against dissent. Many are quietly revising their positions, distancing themselves from previous judgments, reframing their participation in consensus as less committed than it actually was, creating retroactive narrative editing as they attempt to avoid being wrong through pretending. They were never fully convinced by story. They were confidently asserting before dissent made it questionable. Some observers are experiencing shame, recognizing they participated in potentially unjust collective judgment without sufficient individual examination. They're uncomfortable with having joined consensus that single voice revealed might be wrong, creating guilt about having been part of group dynamic that may have harmed you through confident assertion of questionable narrative. Others are defensive, protecting themselves from recognition that they might have been wrong by attacking dissenting voice or doubling down on original narrative, resisting collapse through asserting that single dissent doesn't disprove consensus, even though their defensive intensity reveals underlying uncertainty that dissent created. The truly powerful element is how rapidly certainty dissolved. Collective confidence that seemed unshakable evaporated almost instantly when single credible voice challenged narrative, revealing fragility that unanimous agreement had been masking. A single voice stood for you. The city went silent, and scrambling revision began as people realized their unified story wasn't truth but was consensus that couldn't survive dissent. Now the architects are analyzing what created narrative fragility, and they're identifying what they call evidence-free consensus construction, when collective judgment forms through social agreement rather than through careful evaluation of evidence. Resulting narrative appears solid while everyone agrees but is actually hollow construction that collapses when challenged because it was never built on foundations strong enough to withstand scrutiny, making consensus-dependent certainty fundamentally different from evidence-based confidence that can survive dissenting perspectives. Most people assume their strongly held beliefs are evidence-based. They feel certain because evidence supports their position, making confidence seem justified by facts rather than recognizing it often derives from social reinforcement, where everyone agreeing creates feeling of certainty, regardless of evidentiary foundation, but collective judgment about you, apparently formed through social cascade rather than careful analysis. Initial negative interpretation gained momentum as people joined consensus without independently evaluating evidence, creating socially constructed narrative that felt true because everyone agreed, rather than because evidence compellingly supported it. Consider what evidence-free consensus means about collective judgment formation. Initial interpretation set narrative direction. Early voices establishing particular framing of your situation created momentum that subsequent people joined without questioning, making later consensus reflect social following rather than independent evaluation, where each person examined evidence and reached similar conclusion. Social proof replaced evidence. Seeing others condemn you made people feel justified in their own condemnation without requiring them to carefully examine whether evidence actually supported collective judgment, creating consensus through conformity rather than through convergent independent analysis. Watch what evidence-free foundation created in narrative fragility. Story couldn't defend itself against dissent. When credible voice challenged narrative, consensus couldn't point to overwhelming evidence because story was built on agreement rather than on solid evidentiary foundation, making defense impossible beyond asserting but everyone thought this, which isn't argument when dissent demonstrates that universal agreement doesn't guarantee truth. Confidence revealed as social rather than rational. People's certainty about narrative dissolved rapidly because it was never based on evidence they'd personally evaluated but was borrowed from seeing others' certainty, making their confidence secondhand social confidence that evaporated when single dissent made them question whether others' certainty was justified. Some studying social psychology recognize that consensus often forms through informational cascades. Early adopters create impression of certainty that later people follow without independent evaluation, creating situations where everyone confidently believes something that may not be well-founded because each person's confidence derives from others. Confidence in self-reinforcing cycle rather than from evidence. Each person examined independently, others exploring groupthink and collective delusion. Note that unanimous agreement can emerge through conformity pressure rather than through truth convergence. When dissenting becomes socially costly, people suppress doubts and join consensus, creating false unanimity that masks underlying uncertainty, making apparently solid collective judgment actually fragile construction that collapses when someone brave enough to break ranks reveals that others harbored suppressed doubts too. A few from epistemology recognize that social consensus and evidential support are different. Justification types. Belief can be socially justified through everyone, agreeing while being evidentially unjustified through lacking solid support from facts, making distinction crucial for understanding why. Consensus-based certainty is more fragile than evidence-based confidence that can survive social disagreement. The architects observe that evidence-free consensus construction is what made narrative vulnerable to single dissent. Collective judgment about you was built on social agreement rather than on careful evidence evaluation, making story appear solid through unanimity. While actually being hollow construction, most certainty should be evidence-based. Consensus was socially constructed, and fragility where single, credible dissent triggered complete narrative collapse revealed that collective confidence was never grounded in foundations strong enough to withstand challenge, explaining why City went silent and began scrambling. Revision when one voice stood for you rather than defending. Narrative through pointing to overwhelming evidence that supposedly supported collective judgment. Something powerful is spreading through collective now. What the architects call consensus participant retroactive distancing, where people who confidently participated in condemning narrative are now scrambling to minimize or deny their involvement, revising their past positions to appear less committed than they actually were, creating collective amnesia about unanimous agreement that existed before. Dissent made participation embarrassing. Most people maintain consistency between past and present positions. When they change their minds, they acknowledge previous view while explaining why they've revised it, maintaining narrative continuity about their evolving understanding. But facing potential wrongness about you is triggering different response. Rather than acknowledging they participated in consensus that might have been unjust, many are retroactively editing their involvement to protect current self-concept from uncomfortable recognition that they joined potentially harmful collective judgment without sufficient individual examination. Watch what retroactive distancing creates practically. Memory is being revised. People who vocally condemned you now claim they never fully agreed or always had doubts, despite their past confident participation in consensus, creating revisionist personal history that protects them from accountability for having joined collective judgment that dissent revealed might be wrong. Responsibility is being deflected rather than acknowledging their role in constructing narrative. Many are blaming others for creating story they reluctantly went along with, positioning themselves as passive followers rather than active participants despite their previous confident assertions, contributing to consensus that gained momentum through each person's participation. Some are claiming they were silenced, insisting they privately disagreed but felt unable to speak up, positioning themselves as suppressed dissenters rather than willing participants, protecting self-concept through claiming they knew better all along but were prevented from saying so by social pressure. They're now acknowledging only after it's safe to dissent. Others are reframing their participation, claiming they were just asking questions or expressing concerns rather than making definitive judgments, minimizing their condemning language to appear more measured than they actually were, creating revisionist interpretation of their past. Statements that makes them seem less culpable for participation in consensus that might have harmed you unjustly. A few are going completely silent, hoping their past participation will be forgotten if they don't draw attention to it, avoiding acknowledgement or apology through pretending their condemning voice was never added to collective judgment. They're now quietly abandoning as indefensible. Some studying cognitive dissonance recognize that retroactive distancing serves psychological self-protection, admitting you participated in potentially unjust collective judgment creates uncomfortable awareness of having been wrong in ethically significant way, making memory revision and responsibility deflection psychologically easier than accepting culpability for having confidently condemned someone who may not have deserved condemnation. Others exploring moral psychology note that people resist seeing themselves as having caused unjust harm, self-concept, as good person who wouldn't participate in wrongful condemnation conflicts with evidence of having joined consensus that might have been harmful, creating motivation to revise history in ways that preserve preferred self-concept, rather than acknowledging uncomfortable truths about past behavior. A few recognize that collective retroactive distancing prevents learning. If everyone denies having fully participated in consensus, then group can't examine how collective judgment went wrong or develop safeguards against future similar mistakes, making responsibility avoidance through memory revision prevent growth that acknowledging errors would enable. The architects observe that consensus participant retroactive distancing reveals that many who confidently condemned you are now scrambling to minimize their involvement, revising memories, deflecting responsibility, claiming they doubted all along despite past confident participation. Admission of error enables learning. Retroactive distancing prevents accountability and widespread memory revision where consensus participants are denying they were ever fully committed reveals that collective judgment's apparent solidity was partly illusion, maintained through social pressure that lifted once single dissent, made it safe to acknowledge doubts many harbored, privately while publicly performing certainty that contributed to unanimous condemnation. Now the architects are revealing what gave single dissenting voice its power. The defender apparently possessed what they call credibility, authority, consensus breaking capacity, where their standing, reputation, or position was sufficiently established that their dissent couldn't be dismissed through usual social mechanisms that groups use to suppress disagreement, forcing collective to seriously engage with alternative interpretation rather than marginalizing dissenting voice and maintaining consensus through social exclusion. Most dissent can be contained when someone without standing challenges consensus. Group easily dismisses them through questioning their credibility, expertise, or motives, protecting narrative from challenge through excluding dissenter rather than engaging with their arguments. But voice that stood for you apparently carried credentials or authority that made dismissal impossible. Their standing was too established, their reputation too solid, their position too recognized for group to simply exclude them as unreliable, forcing collective to actually consider possibility that consensus might be wrong rather than protecting certainty through marginalizing challenger. Consider what credibility authority required for effective dissent. The defender had recognized standing, whether through expertise, moral authority, past reliability, or social position. They possessed credibility that made their voice count in ways that prevented easy dismissal, forcing group to take dissent seriously rather than discounting it as coming from unreliable source. Their dissent was public and clear. Rather than privately expressing doubts, they openly challenged narrative in ways that couldn't be ignored or minimized, creating unavoidable disruption to consensus that private disagreement wouldn't have achieved, because public credible dissent forces collective response that private doubt doesn't require. Watch what credibility authority created in consensus disruption. Dismissal strategies failed. Usual methods for protecting consensus through attacking dissenters. Credibility didn't work because defender standing was too established, forcing group to engage with substance of their challenge rather than avoiding it through discrediting source, making substantive rather than ad hominem engagement necessary once dismissal proved impossible. Social cascade reversed just as consensus formed through people following early condemners. Dissent gained momentum through people reconsidering once credible, voice-challenged narrative. creating reverse social cascade, where defenders' standing made it socially acceptable to question consensus that had seemed unquestionable, while unanimity maintained. Some studying social influence recognize that credibility dramatically affects persuasion. Same message from low credibility versus high credibility source produces different responses, with high credibility sources changing minds more effectively because their authority makes resistance more difficult, explaining why defenders' standing was crucial for dissent's impact. Others exploring authority and expertise note that groups do defer to recognized voices when someone with established credentials challenges consensus. Their expertise or authority creates pressure to reconsider that ordinary dissent wouldn't generate, making credibility crucial resource for those attempting to shift collective judgment. A few from organizational dissent research recognize that speaking truth to power requires protection. Whistleblowers, reformers, consensus challengers all need either sufficient authority to withstand retaliation or external protections that make suppression costly, suggesting defender either had enough standing to resist social punishment or situation provided protections that made defending you less risky than it might otherwise have been. Some are questioning whether you deserved defense, wondering if defenders' credibility should make them reconsider consensus, or if maybe defender is wrong despite their standing, revealing tension between respecting authority and maintaining independent judgment about whether credible dissent actually reveals error in consensus or is just influential mistake. The architects observe that credibility, authority, consensus breaking capacity is what made single voice sufficient to shatter narrative. Defender possessed standing that prevented dismissal, forcing serious engagement with their challenge rather than allowing protective marginalization. Most dissent can be excluded. Credible dissent demands response, and authority carrying weight that consensus couldn't ignore is why single voice standing for you was sufficient to trigger collapse rather than being absorbed or dismissed as previous potential. Dissenters might have been if they'd challenged narrative without possessing credentials that made their dissent impossible to dismiss through usual social exclusion mechanisms groups used to maintain consensus against challenge. The architects are now analyzing your experience during consensus condemnation period. You apparently maintained what they call vindication, faith, persecution, endurance, where despite collective judgment against you, you preserved internal conviction that truth would eventually emerge and that unjust narrative would collapse once someone examined evidence carefully, rather than just joining social consensus, creating capacity to endure being collectively condemned through holding faith that vindication was inevitable even when it seemed everyone believed distorted story about you. Most people internalize collective judgment. When everyone says you're wrong or bad, you begin doubting yourself, questioning whether maybe they're right and you're mistaken about your own experience or character, making it difficult to maintain conviction against unanimous consensus that social pressure makes feel like objective truth. But you apparently possessed sufficient self-knowledge or truth certainty to maintain internal position despite external unanimity against you, knowing that narrative was wrong, even when everyone believed it, trusting that truth would eventually surface, despite being temporarily obscured by social construction everyone had agreed to treat as factual. Consider what vindication faith requires psychologically. You maintained conviction despite isolation. Standing alone against collective judgment without support creates intense pressure to doubt yourself or capitulate to consensus, making your capacity to preserve truth certainty despite universal disagreement reflect exceptional internal strength or unusual clarity about your own experience and character. You trusted in eventual revelation, believing that truth would surface, even when it seemed permanently buried under narrative everyone believed, required faith that reality would eventually assert itself against social construction, making your endurance reflect not just stubbornness but genuine confidence. That distorted story couldn't persist indefinitely once someone examined carefully. Watch what vindication faith created during persecution. You didn't internalize condemnation. Rather than accepting collective judgment as valid assessment of your character or actions, you maintained awareness that narrative was distorted construction rather than accurate representation, protecting self-concept from damage that internalizing unjust condemnation would have created. You preserved dignity through isolation, despite being universally condemned. You didn't collapse into defensive desperation or desperate attempts to convince people of your innocence, maintaining composed position that you were right and they were wrong, even when numerical superiority was entirely on their side. Some studying resilience and persecution recognize that maintaining conviction against collective judgment requires exceptional strength. Social animals, like humans, experience intense pressure to conform to group consensus, making capacity to preserve independent position despite universal disagreement reflect unusual psychological fortitude or deep self-knowledge that withstands social pressure. Others exploring truth and vindication note that history includes many examples where individuals were right against collective judgment. Galileo, Semmelweis, whistleblowers, and reformers all maintained truth positions despite consensus against them, with eventual vindication proving their conviction justified despite intense social pressure to capitulate, making your faith in eventual truth emergence reflect pattern where reality eventually corrects social distortions. If someone persists in asserting truth, a few recognize that vindication faith can be double-edged. While maintaining conviction against collective judgment is admirable when you're actually right, same psychological pattern could make someone persist in error if they're actually wrong, making distinction between justified vindication faith and delusional conviction difficult to determine. While within situation before outcome reveals whether persistence was warranted or misguided. Some attempting to learn from your experience recognize that preserving self-knowledge against social pressure is valuable. Capacity, being able to maintain independent assessment of yourself despite collective judgment, enables resisting unjust narratives, making your vindication faith model for how to endure being wrongly condemned without internalizing distorted collective narrative as if it were truth. The architects observed that vindication faith, persecution, endurance is what enabled you to survive. Period. When everyone believed false narrative, you maintained conviction that truth would emerge despite being isolated in your position, preserving dignity and self-concept through collective condemnation. Most internalize collective judgment. You maintained independent truth, certainty, and capacity to endure unanimous consensus against you while preserving faith in eventual vindication is why you're still standing now. That single voice broke ranks, revealing that collective confidence was hollow construction rather than solid truth. Now something's emerging that the architects call authority voice impact, asymmetry, recognition. Observers are discovering that while single credible voice was sufficient to shatter consensus condemning you, rebuilding your reputation or achieving full vindication will require many voices or much time, because destruction through collective judgment happens rapidly while restoration through vindication proceeds slowly, revealing that social narratives exhibit asymmetry, where negative consensus forms quickly but positive rehabilitation develops gradually. Most people assume symmetry. If collective condemnation happened rapidly, then vindication should restore reputation equally quickly once consensus is revealed as wrong, making timelines seem fair or balanced. But reality shows asymmetry. Single dissenting voice shattered certainty, making people question narrative. But this questioning phase doesn't immediately translate to full reversal, where everyone now believes you were right all along, creating period where narrative is no longer confidently asserted but replacement story hasn't yet formed, making you exist in liminal space between condemnation and vindication. Watch what asymmetry creates practically. Silence isn't support, city going silent after confident. Condemnation represents uncertainty rather than reversal, making absence of continued attacks feel like progress while not actually constituting positive vindication, because people aren't asserting you were right. They're just uncertain about whether you were wrong. Rehabilitation is gradual. Even people who now doubt narrative that condemned you may not actively defend or support you, making recovery of reputation slow process, requiring accumulation of rehabilitation voices over time rather than instant restoration once consensus collapses. Some studying reputation and social narratives recognize that negativity bias affects narrative dynamics. Negative information spreads faster and sticks more firmly than positive information, making condemnation narratives form rapidly and persist stubbornly, while vindication narratives develop slowly and establish weakly, creating asymmetry that disadvantages those who've been wrongly condemned, even after truth begins emerging. Others exploring justice and restoration note that destroying reputation is easier than rebuilding it. Breaking things is generally faster than constructing them, making reputation destruction through false narrative proceed more rapidly than reputation restoration through truth revelation, creating injustice where harm happens quickly, but healing proceeds slowly regardless of whether original condemnation was justified. A few recognize that vindication requires active narrative construction. Silence or doubt about condemning narrative doesn't automatically create exonerating counter-narrative, making vindication require someone to actively construct and promote story of your innocence, rather than just allowing condemning story to collapse into vacuum, suggesting that defenders' voice alone may not be sufficient, and that full rehabilitation might require additional advocates, building positive narrative rather than just challenging negative one. Some are questioning what full vindication would look like, whether it requires everyone admitting they were wrong and apologizing, or whether it's sufficient if condemning narrative simply fades without explicit reversal, determining standards for what counts as vindication and whether achieving it is realistic goal, or whether some reputational damage persists despite truth eventually emerging. Others recognizing authority voice asymmetry feel frustrated if single credible voice could trigger condemnation collapse. Why can't same voice trigger immediate vindication establishment, revealing tension between understanding that rehabilitation is slower process and feeling that asymmetry is unjust, making restoration more difficult than destruction in ways that unfairly disadvantage wrongly condemned. The architects observe that authority voice impact asymmetry recognition reveals that your vindication journey is beginning rather than complete. Single voice shattered condemnation consensus creating uncertainty, but moving from uncertainty to positive vindication requires additional work that may not proceed as rapidly or dramatically as consensus collapse occurred. City went silent after confident condemnation, but silence isn't vindication, and asymmetry where destruction happens quickly while restoration proceeds slowly means that even though narrative condemning you has collapsed, full rehabilitation remains ongoing process rather than instant reversal. That single dissenting voice achieved for shattering, but not yet for rebuilding.